My life has been marked by being a citizen of the world ever since I was born into it. My parents were James Williams and Jill Jenner, both from the humble origins who met in the Celtic Victorian city of London at the end of the 19th century. Back then, there was a lot of work in the new industry of ships and steam locomotives. For decades, the country's economy had been rising thanks to all these inventions, but the working conditions were unskilled laborers and miners had no improved. They had no rights and earned a miserable wage, which fostered unrest within the lower classes. Many of them did not reach the age of due to diseases such as tuberculosis, smallpox, and starvation. All the meanwhile, the government put all its effort and interest waging wars to maintain its imperialist hegemony over its colonies, such as the Indian Rebellion in 1857 to 1858, or later the Second Boer War in South Africa from 1889 to 1902, neglecting the needs of its citizens. In the middle of this crisis, my recently married parents decided to emigrate to America in 1889 in search of new opportunities. My father got a job as a coolman for the liner that took them to the New World in 1890. They touched the land and they moved to Pennsylvania, where my father started working at a steel mill as an immigrant still without any official papers for a salary lower than the Americans. Unfortunately, by 1891, this factory went on strike, also due to low wages and poor working conditions, generating one of the most serious labor conflicts in the United States, and leaving my father without a job while my mother was pregnant, putting them in a desperate situation since I was on my way and they had no resources. Returning to Europe was not an option, not only because such a trip was complicated and expensive, but also because news reached us in America in of recent crisis situation in several countries, such as the popular upsprings in Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire political conflict in Bosnia. News that took long to reach us, since they were being brought from Europe of this was before the Italian Guillermo Marconi invented the wireless long-distance radio transmissions in 1903. So my parents had to move once again this time to a small town in Ohio where they hired my dad as a bicycle factory, which belonged to the Wright brothers. The wages were better than in the steel company and it allowed them to rent a small property in the country, where on January 22 of 1892 I was born with the name of Lewis, which my father insisted on naming me. I was born to a beautiful sunset, the first of many that I would enjoy during my childhood and adolescence in Kitty Hawk Bay, where my family life was marked when I was witnessed the first flight of a motorized plane created by the owners of the same bike company that hired my dad. I remember I was 11 years old and I was waiting with astonishment for the event that was the talk of the town. That morning on December 17th of 1903, after several attempts, they finally succeeded. They flew a plane with an engine heavier than the wind of 12 seconds over 36 meters. I remember that the whole town celebrated with festivities for several days, and many people, journalists, and authorities from all over the country came to witness it. Since that I knew that I had to work in a place where such amazing new machines would be created, that chance came unexpectedly when I was 16, but not with the Wright brothers as I always imagined. My friend Tom from high school invited me to go on a trip visit his uncle's on Detroit, where workers were the being sued for the new Ford automobile factory that was beginning to produce the Model T, the first mass produced automobile which allow us to lower their costs and make cars more accessible to the population. Then other products begin to be produced in the series, and not only the automotive industry, but many others grew by boosting the economy of the United States. So, through the spirit of my family, I told my parents my decision to leave home and start a new life for myself, where I matured and met my first love, Charlotte. By the 1910s, the world was doing well economically, although certain nations still had internal political and social conflicts to resolve. I perfectly remember that after having worked for 5 continuous years for the fourth automotive factory during 1914, one of the last suspected events in the world occurred, mainly in Central Europe. This event was known as the Great War. Unfortunately, I found out in a newspaper that morning in which I read that a young Serbian student linked to the clandestine nationalism organization called Black Hand assassinated in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to their Austro-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Duchess Sofia. Months later, returning from factory, I heard in a last-minute broadcast that the nation of Austria-Hungary had formally declared war on Serbia. At the moment, I knew that the times would change and this would bring serious consequences to my life. I felt in a moment of despair and eager to know what would happen in my life. I would be drafted or I would lose everything I loved. It was not until 1950 when the situation became critical and the countries around Austria began to take a stance on upcoming war. Among these, uh, the called alliances between countries were formed, which generated a dispute between two sides in such a way that Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Italy constitute the side of Central Powers, and by other hand, the alliance of the triple entity was constituted by the Great Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Portugal, Romania, Greece, and finally, in 1917, the United States. This news undoubtedly brought me many regrets, such as having to leave Charlotte, but I had to serve the nation. I had already get planned to married with Charlotte. I perfectly remember that day, April 6th of 1917, when two military commanders of the United States Army knocked my front door. Charlotte was in tears, listening to soldiers, so I had no choice and I left Charlotte to go fight to the war. During my trip to Europe, I was transferred to New York, where I left the main pier for the north coast of France. Upon arrival in the area, I was part of the first platoon of American Expeditionary Force. In June of 1980, I was first sent to the flight of the Battle of Chantilly, where I was attached to the French forces to fight the German side. The battle instead of for about a month without any communication, without resources, just me and my companions. Finally, the Germans without their forces, and we managed to return to our safe zone. At the end of the war, I remember that I had presented high rates of psychological problems. It was heartbreaking for me personally. I was not the same as before. It was from a signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, in which peace was agreed and the League of Nations were created with the aim of preventing future international conflicts, which ended the Great War, and we began to return to our countries of origin. When I returned to America, Charlotte, my parents were waiting for me on Detroit with happiness and eagerness to resume my life. I was fortunate to return, however, things had changed. There were initial economic problems, but I left the war. Although I still don't have a job, I had a veteran pension that allowed me to marry and move to New York with Charlotte to start a new life together. That w- that's where our two children were born, so I need more resources to find a job soon. It was in those years that I met a certain Frank Costello who had a flourishing businesses in New York and offered me to work for him for a very good wage. The profits were great. The era of provision had just begun, and our product sold really well, which allowed me to provide a comfortable lifestyle for my family for many years. Despite the fact in 1929 the United States economy collapsed due to the crash of the sudden fall in the stock market, the famous Black Thursday of October 29, which led to the loss of millions of dollars in investments and collapsed the USA financial market. Our business was thriving until 1933, when the prohibition was removed, sales began to decline, and although the economy of country was very bad, I had accumulated considerable wealth, which enabled me to invest in this construction sector. That was how I bought some properties, mainly a piece of land of the corner of the Fifth Avenue, where with some partners we began to build one of the first skyscrapers. One of the main consequences of this crisis was the world trade collapsed, since the United States was the world's leading producer and also the main market. Industrial production in major countries fell by 50%, resulting in an increase of unemployment to 12 to 50 million in the United States, to 6 million in Germany, 3 million in Great Britain. In Czechoslovakia, there were almost a million in employment in a population of 30 million inhabitants. In response to this crisis, in 1933, the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, launched a series of government programs known as the New Deal, with the aim of combating poverty and stimulating the country's economy, achieving an excellent results. Although my fortune was not seriously affected, we had to reduce expenses and jobs in the businesses we had. I must confess that although in those years I already had enough resources to ever return to my parents' country, I was never able to do so due to the new great crisis, the World War II, unleashed in Europe. Things started when Adolf Hitler entered the German government in 1933 with the aim of making its first European power. Resentment had grown into German population and they were made to pay reparations for the Great War. The people resonated with his nationalism, which led him to invade several European countries, sparking a crisis when he invaded Poland in 1939. It was at this time that France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. By 1941, Germany allied with Italy and Japan, forming the Axis powers. Against them, the Western democracies were allied. Great Britain, France, Poland, the United States, and the Soviet Union, calling themselves the Great Alliance. From New York, I followed the news every day, more surprised, like what happened in the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, which was the most important bloody and long campaigns lasting a year, in which the Soviet Union emerged victorious against the Axis powers, strongly weakening the German troops. Another piece of news that shocked me when I read it at home was on December 7, in 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy carried out a surprise attack on the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii, which all the time was the home of the United States Pacific Fleet. The attack was carried by 353,100 Japanese aircraft and resulted in the destruction of 8 warships, including the USS Arizona and more than 200 USA aircraft. 2,143 Americans were killed and another 1,178 wounded. The attack was the main reason the United States entered to the World War II, but perhaps the news that struck me the most was that on August 6 of 1945, the United States dropped a nuclear weapon on Hiroshima, Japan, killing more than 100 people instantly. The 3 days later, on August 9 of 1945, the United States dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, killing an estimated 40 million people. That the consequences were disturbing, and the atomic bomb was never used on the world again. Starting in 1945, the world changed, and I no longer understood many things. The fight to the death between capitalism and communism that maintained the Cold War and the tremendous events of the 60s, such as the space race, turned the world into a dangerous and horrid place. The strangest thing about these times was that a lone shooter fired without warning or cause a bullet that in city of Dallas, Texas, killed half of the world, along with the President John F. Kennedy.